Hi, this is Bryan Caplan, author of Build Baby Build. I'm here with David Schleicher of the Yale Law School. How you doing, David?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me.
All right. You have a very impressive record of defending YIMBYism in your work. I noticed you've got a very cool piece going over the defenders of exclusionary zoning in the world of legal academia. What's going on with these guys?
The funny thing is, someone joked with me that that piece is one of the first pieces that ever says there's a conventional academic wisdom that's been challenged, and the conventional wisdom is correct. And basically, what I went through is a couple of people who are trying the academic move of being, I don't know, edgy or weird about this, and went through their arguments in some depth and found them wanting. The big thing that one of the things that piece identifies is that that many of the critics of land use deregulation, maybe not all the way to during abolition, but just broader deregulation, are kind of make left-leaning sounds.
Mm-hmm.
But in fact, if you look through their arguments, they're really deeply conservative. I don't mean conservative right wing. I mean conservative skeptical about change in
Sure.
ways that are like really dramatically at odds with their stated egalitarianism, and also are completely nonsensical, to my mind. So I go through a couple of them in it. But at one point I say of one of the papers, these may be social democratic men, but this is an arch Tory paper.
Hmm. Right. I mean, one thing that's pretty striking when people interview me and say, well, who are the best defenders of the status quo? It's like, well, it's kind of odd. It's a weird situation because most people are quite adamant about certain kinds of housing regulation that they're directly familiar with, but without having much of a national agenda. So again, it's not the story where it's just people are defending the property value seems to be wrong empirically, because you'll see that tenants will also be in favor of existing regulations, but it's a very particularist kind of support for regulation. Right here, right now, I don't want that building casting shadows. But if you're saying, should we have a big anti-shadow movement, then I don't know anyone who wants to have a crusade against shadows. Do you?
Yeah, so no, and I mean, amusingly enough, people of course love shadows. Like when it's on a sunny day, you can see people. One of the best kind of there's a protest against a building for having shadows, but it was a sunny, hot day in New York City. This is about the Blood Center in New York City, if anyone's interested. And all of the protesters were up against a wall in the shadows because it was really hot and worried about getting sunburns. No, I mean, so there's some degree of things that take the form of value maximization, or people, particularly around limiting access to suburbs. You see that a lot. That's like about the kind of Bruce Hamilton style, like tax limitation. We just want to keep the average property values up so we don't ever have to raise property taxes and do any type of local redistribution. But lots of it really takes the form of either like a particular form of localism, which is, how things are here is different and better than things are in other places. And then really, what I think it really is a type of conservatism. And by the way, this is like not a weird political preference. That like I'm afraid of change is one of the most common political beliefs, right? Like anything that's different from this is bad. What's interesting to me, or one of the things that's interesting to me about this, is that people don't take that conservatism and apply it to any other area of their lives. So like all the arguments people make in favor of land use regulation, or not all of them, but many of them, could be made in favor of clothes regulation. That's to say, we should be regulating hemlines because, people will be coming in, it'll be changing the nature of the neighborhood if people come in with short skirts or long skirt or whatever, and the same people who would announce like, like change here is bad would view that as abhorrent excessive government regulation. That would just be Big Brother gone mad. But it's all aesthetics. It's all how we live, and no one makes that distinction or explains why they're inconsistent across those issues either.
Hmm. I mean, the way that you're describing it, it makes me realize that I'm kind of surprised that more economists aren't pro regulation here, because a standard thing to do in an Econ 1 textbook is to find existing regulations and then say, well, which market failure theory rationalizes the status quo? That's what economists actually do. It's contrary to the neoliberal or libertarian story about what economists are like. Actually, it's much more normal for economists to be
Yeah.
conservative in the sense of just rationalizing that whatever is a good idea. You can call it Panglossian is the way that I like to think about it. I think it's more evocative than conservative. And it
Before,
definitely is. So, I mean, it's pretty easy when you look at regulation, say, well, this solves this negative externality problem. This solves that negative externality problem. What's striking is that if you really understand the textbook model well, it's like, well, that's not really the best way to go and handle the problem if it exists. It's not to say never, 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 no way. It's to say there's going to be a price for doing it. And if you pay the price, you can do whatever you want.
yeah. So prior to the takeoff of land use controls or the difference between demand and land use controls in hot demand cities starting in roughly the late 70s and 80s,
Mm-hmm.
that is basically what economists did with respect to land use. There were obviously some critics, and you have
Mm-hmm.
Bernie Segan and some people who are critics of this, and Bob Ellickson, one of my heroes and mentors. But if you look at like Bill Fischel or Bruce Hamilton, that's the way the way they're understanding the land use problem. Up through literature in the 1990s, really. And their basic model, like the Fischelian model, who's again one of my professors and
Mm-hmm.
friends, is that like the
Home
way
voter hypothesis.
yeah, the home voter hypothesis. But his first piece, which is I think even more important than the home voter hypothesis, because it actually explains both, like it fits the law very neatly, which is that it says you should understand zoning as a town's collective property right, and that rather than grant or kind of a Coasian type argument, granting the owner of land the right to build unless they get bought out, you can grant the property right to the town and force the individual to buy out. And those should end up in the same place, absent transaction costs. And the transaction cost minimizing strategy, according to Fischel, is the giving it to the town and forcing and so that's the way the argument works. And it fits the way American land use law works, which allows ordinarily or historically with respect to nuisances, it was a very narrow category of things that could be nuisances, but we allow ex ante nuisance regulation, I don't know why I put quotes up there, ex ante nuisance regulation to cover just like not liking things, like aesthetic regulation, or more controversially, but realistically, not liking people. So there's a famous case that involves a frat house and or a group home near a university. And the Supreme Court dealt with the question, could you regulate the number of unrelated people who live in a house? And this seems like, I don't know, that when it was just challenged by a bunch of law professors said, I don't know what element of the Constitution this violates, but it has to violate all of them because that's just outrageous. Like, why can't three people live together? What if they're a throuple? Who knows? Whatever. They didn't quite put it that way, but that's what they meant. And the Supreme Court says, no, it's totally fine to regulate the number of people who live in a house, which has to be like one of our most intimate, type of decisions because
As
of
long as they're not related.
But as long as they're not related, right? Yes, because of the potential externality. Maybe it will create more parking. Maybe it will need demand for roads. Maybe it will, and they make this whole thing like
whereas blood relatives don't make externalities.
Exactly right. Yeah, but it will. They make a whole thing where it will intrude on the family nature, a place where people can play ball, and you can hear the violins playing the national anthem and people eating apple pie while they throw a baseball around, and this will intrude on that. And Fischel's model really does capture that, which is that it doesn't matter why people don't like people or new people. You can just make them pay regardless. But one of the funny things, and one of the things I think your book highlights really well through it, going through the literature, is that things really did change. It got a lot worse. At some point, I mean, there's always the theoretical problems, but the things got a lot worse and have been getting worse for now more than 30 years, maybe even 40 years. And even the people who wrote those models think things have gone way too far. So and they think there's been some kind of shift, and they have some explanations for why, involving kind of the role environmentalism plays in coming up with a thing to talk about when people just want to be selfish or conservative or whatever. It
All
is
right. So yeah, we're almost out of time. So two last things. So one, there is a hilarious throwaway line in Fischl where he says, "Well, if you actually go to the meetings, it seems kind of like these people are crazy, but they're not." And this is like you go to all these meetings, you yourself say they seem crazy, and particularly the idea that you can negotiate with these people, just like, no, absolutely not, never. I would rather die than let you go and remove one bird nest. Right. But last point, what's pretty striking to me is that a lot of people will say, first of all, it's super evil for local governments to not go and provide a bunch of free stuff for everybody, regardless of income. But second of all, it's perfectly fine to go and prevent poor people from living in your town. It's like, well, like, what's the point of that? Like, what's the point of saying anybody here gets tons of great stuff, but also we're going to try to keep people out? It's like, how about you don't give me free stuff, but you let me live here?
Oh, I mean, there's a real interesting set of questions about whether like rules about equal service requirements have an effect on land use controls. And there's a lot of reason to think they might, right? Which is if you could charge people, I'm working on something on property taxes that kind of works in this flavor. Mm-hmm. But it is definitely strange that, you have these like people who seem to be fans of egalitarianism, or not even just giving everyone free stuff, but giving redistributive stuff, right? Giving more to people, but then who are at the same time don't come in. And it creates all sorts of unbelievably perverse incentives. It's very similar to your stuff on immigration, right? Like it's the same. One thing I'll say, because
we would feel so guilty if we didn't help you, if you were near us. So get the hell out.
Exactly, right. It's complete. One thing I will say, and one of the reasons I just loved your book, I'm putting up again here again,
thank you.
Is that one of the things I'm really worried about in the land use econ profession type issues is that I don't think people are going to write papers about why land use controls are bad because it's too obvious. Everyone agrees. There's an elite consensus. So there's some people in urban studies or sociology or who knows what who don't agree. But writing papers that just say at the regional level, constraints on housing increase prices and reduce output is like going to be the equivalent of saying water runs downhill. Mm-hmm. And I don't like it's going to be something you have a like a college student or first year grad student to write, but it's not going to be the kind of thing that gets published in top journals or any journals. And one of the questions that remain is like, there are going to be kooky people coming up with counterintuitive things because that's just what the academia does, is how do you like make clear that the truth is still true if people are not doing it anymore? And one of the things I really loved about your book, and the piece you mentioned tries to do in a different way, but a kind of sanctioning way rather than a positive way, is that it just lays out the evidence in a very approachable way that is not like I'm doing a narrow empirical stuff. Here's the evidence, and so the book I think is doing a real public service in giving us something to say. Like that's like a useful way of reminding people of the kind of huge weight of the evidence at the morally relevant level, which is the regional level.
All right, so I think we are out of time, but thank you very much, David Schleicher. And definitely, if anyone's thinking about course adoptions, David is my go-to man. Love what you got to say. All right, so
thank you so much for having me.
Talk to you later. Bye-bye.